Okay, so in this video, we're going to be making a housing joint. Now, the first thing to do is we're going to be using a piece of timber that's 15 centimeters long or 150 millimeters. And you're going to take a metal ruler and place it up against the very edge, remembering that the metal ruler measures right from the very start. So if you push your finger up against the edge, make sure it's level with the edge, and then measure the total distance. So if it is 15 centimeters, you're going to measure and mark halfway. It might be slightly bigger or slightly smaller, so just check that it's, and just mark halfway. It doesn't matter particularly if it's bigger or smaller. And if you take a set square, make sure that the stock is pushed firmly up against the edge of the piece of wood. That should make the blade, which is this bit, 90 degrees. Slide it along to the dot and then draw a line across. Now, it's always a good idea to mark down as well. So when you're sawing, you can see that you're sawing straight down. So do a little dot in line with the line that you've just drawn, and then place a set square on the edge like you can see, and then just draw straight down from there. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is I'm placing it on a bench hook, and this section of the hook is placed into the vise so it doesn't move around. And you push it to, if you're right-handed, it's on this side of the bench hook, and if you're left-handed, you can put it on this side of the bench hook. And then obviously get yourself a 10-inch saw and just line it right up with the edge. Just make sure it's not moving around, it needs to be firmly placed. Push it up against the edge. And now the technique is to pull back 3 times to get the initial line up right. And you'll notice that my index finger is positioned on the right hand side of the saw. My other hand is resting on the saw high up, so I don't cut my finger, but just kind of use theirs to keep it nice and straight. My arm should be going straight through the saw and I'm standing to one side. My head should be fairly close over the shoulder of the saw so I can see both sides of the saw. Should make sure it's going straight, just check it, and then start pushing forward so it cuts in the forward motion. So you push forward and then gently back, push forward, gently back, and just keep checking that it's going down the line. So you see my head checking it over and make sure it's going straight. Okay, so once it is being cut, just use a sanding board just to make sure that there's no splintering or any bits that have come off that could give you a splinter. Just to make sure it's fairly smooth, and then repeat on the other piece. Very important to make sure that you're safe. So the splinters obviously can stop you from working and slow you down, and obviously hurt and potentially become infected. So you just got to be careful. Now, just make sure your pencil is nice and sharp, because I'm going to be marking out close and very detailed section here. So you've got to make sure it's nice and sharp. So what I'm doing is I'm positioning one of the pieces on top of the other along the grain. You see the lines running down the grain, so you're marking it out along the grain in the middle, rough, as close to the middle as you can get. And then you just hold it between your thumb and your hand, carefully mark along the line. So I'm basically using this piece as a template. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the depth. So I'm going to measure the distance for the thickness of the wood down. So the total distance should be about 18 millimeters. Half of that being 9 millimeters. And you just put a dot at 9 millimeters. What you can do now is you can use the marking gauge. Now with the marking gauge, you make sure this part, which is the stock, is pushed firmly up against the piece of wood, and then you loosen the thumb screw, which is this bit now, and you can slide the bar along until the little spur, which is the little pin bit, is positioned on the dot that you've just made. Just tighten it, just make sure it's not moved in the tightening process, because sometimes it can, so just check it and then tighten it. And what you do is you just dig it into the wood gently, not too much, and then make sure you're pushing inwards so that there's no gap appearing between the stock and the piece of wood. and you just slide it along, and it should make a parallel line to the edge. Turn it around, and then you can do the same on the other side. So you know how deep you need to do it. And you can just use a pencil then to just go inside the line so you can see it a bit clearer. So you know that you need to stop at that point. I'm just going to mark down along it here, just so that when I'm sawing, I know I'm going to go straight down. So again, with your set square, just mark a line. So I put a dot first, so I knew where to position the set square, and then position your lines across, and then repeat on the other side. Okay, so now I'm going to scribble on the waist side. The waist is the middle bit, so I want to get rid of all the middle. So you always mark the waist. So at this stage, I'm going to use an engineer's vise just to hold it in place a little bit better, because there's not much to clamp to on the piece of wood. So with an engineer's vise, I can clamp it a bit easier and position it with a G clamp to hold it down in position. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to saw down to the line on both sides, which is going to be flat saw all the way across. And I need to position the saw on the waist side of the line. So in this case, the waist is the middle. So I need to make sure I don't saw directly on the line, otherwise I'll take too much away. Because wherever you saw, it turns into sawdust, and you remove that section, and the saw blade has a thickness of about 1 millimeter or 2. So you need to make sure that you don't lose 1 millimeter or 2 off the side you want to keep. So you need to saw on the waist side, touching the line, but on the waist side of it. It's in order to make sure that this piece of wood fits tightly inside. So you can see I pull back 3 times, and then I just then carefully push forward, stop when I get to the line, and then level out the saw. So then make sure it's level across. Keep checking it to make sure it's okay, and you just then flatten the saw out and stop when it's level on both sides and it's level across. And repeat on the other side again, on the waist side of the line, touching the line, but on the waist side. If it's not touching the line, it means you're going to have to file back a bit more afterwards. It'll take longer. So try and make sure it is touching the line, but just on the waist side of the line. Just checking to make sure that you're sawing straight down. And level out the saw and just double check it's down to the halfway marker on both sides. Now I've twisted the engineer's vise around so it's sideways on now, because I don't want to, I'm about to start chiseling and I don't want to chisel it into my body. So I'm making sure that it's lined up so the chisel is going to be going away from me. And you'll see the position to start with is I'm going to place it in the middle. You hit down about firmly 3 or 4 times on the top, and then you're then going to use the chisel as a lever. And if you pull back, you'll see that this section here will probably pop up. So you pull back where the bevel is. Now the bevel is the angle on the chisel, and it just works like a pivot. So if you pull back, just make sure you chisel all the way along the line. So you might need to, if your chisel's not quite big enough, it's better to have a chisel that's slightly smaller than too big. So make sure you choose one that's smaller than the gap, because otherwise you'll damage the edges and it won't work. So dig in and then pull back. You should find that it should pop off. If you need to go a bit deeper, just a little bit deeper along the line. And there you go. It should come off in quite big chunks. And now, instead of positioning your chisel vertically, I'm now going to position it at an angle, bevel side down, which means the angle bit down. It's going to work like almost like a scoop. It's just going to wedge out the wood on this side. So you just tap it gently, bevel side down, and it should lift up that section. Now, if you want to smooth it out or go a bit deeper, just repeat the process. Push down and then lever off that section, and then repeat on the other side. Just slowly getting rid of those bits. And sometimes you can just scrape along. If you only need to remove a tiny little bit, you can scrape along just to try and level it out, just by putting one hand at the back of it, and one hand holding it, and you can just push it through. Be very careful not to put your hand in front of the chisel, because you will stab your hand if you do. And just leveling it to make sure it's perfectly level. If there's any tough bits that you can't do by pushing it, just use the mallet, bevel side down, again to scoop out any sections that you need to remove. Okay, now it's time to check it. Hopefully it should be a fairly tight fit. If you've got to push it in, that's great. If you can't push it in, or if you push it in too much, it could snap. So you've just got to be careful. If it's too tight, just file it down and make sure that it's level. And you've got enough room to push it in without having to force it in. If you force it in, it will snap the two pieces of wood. Okay, so at this stage, you need some PVA wood glue. So what you're going to do is you can use a brush, or I sometimes use a scrap piece of wood. If you're using a brush, make sure it's cleaned properly after you finish with it. We're going to put brush into the gap, reasonable amount of glue, but not too much that it's all going to come out, to make sure that it firmly glues it together. Just make sure the lid's put on afterwards when you finish, the glue doesn't dry out, and then push it into the gap. Make sure it's level. Okay, and then what you're going to do is you can use a scrap piece of, just use a little bit of paper towel or something to clean off any excess glue. And then if you want to speed up the drying process, a bit of heat will dry the glue a bit faster. Just be very careful not to get too close with the dryer, because you can actually melt the glue again. So if it gets too hot, it actually softens. So you're just trying to dry the area. Okay, just trying to warm the area slightly without overheating the glue. Okay, so I'll just speed it up a bit. Okay, when you're happy that it's dried enough, so usually about 10 minutes, if you've got any bits that are overhanging, you can use one of these tools. It's called a surf form, and basically it's like a cheese grater. You've got to be careful on the edges of the piece of wood, because it can make the edges splinter off. So if you're just fairly gentle with it, and ideally push inwards, not pushing off the edge of the piece of wood, because it will make it splinter. So just be really gentle with it, and hopefully it should then speed up the process of the bringing it down to size. And what you position your palm on the back of it, and you position your fingers on the front, and then you can then bring it down to a reasonable level. I'm now going to use a really rough file called a Rasp File. You can position it at 45 degrees, and you go across the material, and it's called cross filing. Make sure it's clamped down firmly. So you go across the material at 45. Again, be gentle with this, because it can again damage the edges. So you've just got to take your time with this. Don't be rushing, otherwise you'll end up damaging your piece of wood. You have to be gentle with it. Now you're doing draw filing, which is just back and forth. So you put your hand on either side, and you just go back and forth with the file. And repeat with I've used a flat file now, so just repeat the same process. You go across the material at 45 degrees, and then you do draw filing again, and hopefully all of those processes should have brought it down and smoothed it as well. And you can then finish with a sanding board, just to make sure it's nice and smooth. Now, any gaps that you have, you can use, obviously if you want to keep it the wood colour, you could use a wood filler, which is the colour of the wood. If you're going to be painting it, then like an all-purpose white filler will work. So then you just push it into the gaps, like so. And again, you can use one of these, or you can use just a scrap piece of wood to push it in with. Just as long as you push the filler in the gaps, then you scrape off the excess, so that it's easier afterwards to file and to sand it down, rather than having to sand all the filler off. So if you put all the excess back into the tub, and just scrape it off. And just any holes that you see, just repeat the process. Again, to speed up the drying process of the filler, you can use some heat. Similar thing, don't get too close to it because you'll burn it and it might, it's not going to dry any quicker. Just trying to warm the area up so it just dries the whole thing a bit quicker. Okay, when it's dry, make sure the lid's back on the filler because otherwise it dries out. So make sure you hear a click and push down firmly all the way around, and then you can put it back into the vise, and then you can just then file down the rough bits, or you can sand any rough bits with the sanding board to make sure it's all nice and smooth again, and then ready for painting. Just using a flat file, don't use the really rough file at this stage because you'll end up damaging the wood. So you just want to use a flat file to remove that because it should come off very easily. Okay.